Have you ever tried to read through the whole Bible? I mean, sit down and open at Genesis 1 and attempt to read every book in the canon. Anybody? Yeah. I'm guessing that you got about 2 books in and hit a wall. That'd be the book of Leviticus that we're reading from today. We have these grand narratives in Genesis and Exodus, and then you just get a list of laws and codes, and it gets really dull. I've read stories of seminarians who have fallen asleep on treadmills while attempting to read this book. I applaud anyone who has not only made it through the reading of Leviticus, but has also taken the time to really think about and figure out, what does this mean for modern life and faith? The chapter of Leviticus we read this morning reminds us that Leviticus was so much more than just a long list of rules to be followed. It was a way of life to usher in the presence of a holy God. Holiness in Leviticus was of great concern, not just because the ancient Israelites thought they had to earn their salvation, but because holiness was an attribute of Israel's God, and thus should be an attribute of Israel's people of God. The whole subject and business of holiness can make us a little uncomfortable. I mean, it's well and good to describe God as holy, but we kind of worry about using that word in relation to humanity. I mean, unless you grew up in a holiness tradition of Christianity, you probably never even heard it much to describe people, except maybe exceptional cases, your desert mothers and fathers, some monastic folks, some deeply humanitarian people, perhaps. It just doesn't seem like a word we should use for just anyone. And while modesty and humility are certainly good traits to have, this idea of holiness is not one that we need to brush off as unattainable. In fact, holiness is not just meant for some hermit living or worldwide champion of the poor. Leviticus tells us that holiness is for all people. And we're not off the hook just because we consider ourselves regular folk. At the beginning of this text, we read that Moses spoke to all of the congregation of Israel, not just priests and leaders, but everyone. That means that all followers of God are called to be holy because God is holy. Note the because. We're not saying that any one of us is ever going to be holy as God is holy, exactly like God is holy, but we are holy because God is holy. The Israelites would have understood that in order to welcome a holy God into their midst, some modicum of holiness had to be maintained within the community. They also understood that God was calling them to be holy as part of the reflection of God to others. The entire community was called to this way of life, and this change of life orientation meant a new and perhaps harder way of conducting their lives. Now, as Christians, we often wonder what this kind of Levitical holiness means for us today. I think if we listen to the words of Jesus in Matthew's gospel, we hear Jesus quote a little piece of Leviticus, at least in part. He says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor.' But then there's this piece afterward that he mentions, 'and hate your enemy,' which is conspicuously absent from the Levitical text he's quoting. I think maybe in Jesus' day, as much as it is today, our phrases get a little warped. But these don't have, this idea of loving and hating and all of this is not in Leviticus. In fact, in none of the Torah would Jesus have been reading that we should hate, hate, hate. Now, I'm sure you can't imagine a society in which someone takes scripture and even makes some lines up to go with it to suit their own desire to hate one another, or unfortunately maybe you can, But this perception of the command to love neighbors as coming with a side of hating enemies is actually pretty foreign to the holiness code of Leviticus. And I'm fairly certain that Jesus knew that in teaching his disciples, and he is clear not to accept that common misquoted teaching as a rule, and instead siding with the justice and mercy presented in the scriptures like the one we read today. Leviticus, in all its tedious glory, actually calls the people of Israel well past the point of simply loving their next-door neighbor, and it certainly never asked them to hate their enemies, far from it. Instead, this intricate text reminds us about a few hard teachings about our neighbors. First, they are not geographic in the sense of next-door neighbors. They are those people with whom we come into contact on a day-to-day basis as we live our lives. In the case of the ancient Israelites, this included everyone from kinsmen to the poor, the rich, the stranger or sojourner in the land, the laborer in the field, the handicapped, and so on. And this teaching redirects us not to think of our neighbor as someone who simply lives nearby, but someone who socially and relationally enters our world and crosses our path, whether we're paying attention to it or not. Today, that might include your grocery store cashier, maybe your stylist or barber, your lawn maintenance guy, the immigrant and their family living up the road, your child's teacher, a person of a minority faith living in your community, perhaps a prisoner or released felon. Our neighbors are among us, and Leviticus asks us to seek out ways both to notice them and to care for them. Second, Leviticus tells us that the command to love neighbors is a necessary one that comes with some very specific rules. As part of our fallen nature, we can easily become self-centered and self-focused. We tend to forget the needs of others while attempting to live our own best lives. And in doing so, we are all worse for it. So we often need someone to remind us to be mindful of others. Rules like these in Leviticus can be wonderful motivating forces when it comes to living out the hard work of love. Jesus builds on these rules when prompting his hearers to love their neighbor far beyond the first mile required of them. And that just like the ancient Israelites, loving their neighbor meant some very specific action items that would likely be difficult. Some of these items in Leviticus may seem a little strange to you and I, but they nonetheless provided a framework for holy living in those ancient times, a framework that Jesus embraced and enhanced in his own teaching. Third, Leviticus reminds us that Israel's God is holy and other. And it's because of this holiness that Israel was to reach well beyond the basic courteousness toward others and stand with those on the margins in ways that just might inconvenience the Israelites. God is not mysterious just because God is God. God is mysterious and holy because God liberates captives, sets free the oppressed, and calls followers of this mystery to do the same. This means when someone is hungry, we make sure they are fed, even if it costs us. When someone is a stranger in our land and they are unrepresented, we make sure they are not forgotten, that they are heard, that they are cared for. When we deal with anyone from any station of life, we do not deal falsely with them, but whenever and wherever we are, we offer honesty and integrity, never bending truth to meet our own needs. We are to care for those who have impairments, not provide stumbling blocks to them. We are to deal justly and fairly with everyone. We are not to hold grudges. We are not to seek vengeance. And we do all of this because God did it first. Fourth and finally, Leviticus reminds us that faith in the one true God means something very specific about how we live our lives, our whole lives. Holiness is not just a matter of soul salvation, but consists of so much more. The requirement of the Levitical code and of Jesus Christ is that there is no distinction between matters of the soul and matters of the body. We are whole beings. Our whole lives matter to God, and thus should matter to one another. All of life, from our business dealings to our sexual mores, to how we care for the earth, to our relationships with our family members, to our eating habits and care of self, to our care for those on the farthest margins of society. It all matters to God. Thus, this passage in Leviticus means loving God and our neighbor requires us to live a life of active loving, conscious decisions to be honest, even when no one is looking, conscious decisions to stand with the oppressed, even when it is unpopular or unsafe, conscious decisions to always provide for the last and the least, conscious decisions to make a place for those who need handicapped access, and conscious decisions to understand that neighbors are not just those we like, but those with whom we share this earth, whether we agree or disagree with their way of life. So love your neighbor as yourself. Love the foreigner as yourself. Be holy because God is holy. You know, maybe Leviticus isn't just some list of arcane rules and customs after all, but instead it provides us a profound statement about who God is and who we ought to be as God's followers. It tells us that any form of religion that disparages the other for the sake of the self, or any legalism that binds people in the name of religion rather than setting them free, is getting holiness wrong. Holiness is not just some self-focused work toward personal purity, but it is just as much, and perhaps more so, an others-focused work toward justice and love. It's not some otherworldly state of being, but a way one acts in everyday places and everyday relationships. So how do we go about holiness today? I think first we realize that holiness does not come from ourselves. Yes, God is commanding holiness from us, but God also promises to be that holiness within us. When we try to be holy on our own, we risk the greatest sin of all, the sin of pride. But holiness is a humility before God and an openness to the transforming power of God's holy way of living in our day-to-day lives. When Jesus teaches holiness to his followers, he provides a transforming initiative to that ancient holiness code of Leviticus and all its misquoting by society. He reminds his disciples that giving of oneself to holiness is not a requirement to be the purest or the best all the time, but is an ongoing life commitment to reaching beyond loving those who are easy to love, and instead loving those we struggle to understand or appreciate. It means stepping beyond mere tolerance and embracing those unlike us with a deep humility and willingness to learn with them and grow with them. We see in Leviticus this repeated phrase at the end of all the commands, "I am the Lord your God." What does this phrase mean? Why use it over and over in this text? I'll admit I'm not a Hebrew scholar, so I won't try to get into the depths of that phrase. But I think we can apply it in ways that the Israelites likely did, and Jesus would have as well. When we honor one another with our honesty, we let people glimpse the honor of the Lord our God. when we share what we have with those who have little, we let people glimpse the generosity of the Lord our God. When we deal justly with people from all walks of life, we let people glimpse the justice and equality before the Lord our God. When we do not hold grudges but forgive abundantly, we let people glimpse the mercy and grace of the Lord our God. When we love those who hate us, when we turn the other cheek, when we go that extra mile, we let people glimpse the profound transformation God's holiness has made on our lives, and we invite them to join us on this journey of holy living. At River Road Church, part of our holy way of living in community is sharing in the ministry of Crossover Healthcare Clinic, providing free health care for low income and immigrant communities around us. It is giving of our time and our money to send missionaries to some of the most remote parts of the world in order to provide care and compassion in Jesus' name. It is sacrificing some of our own financial comforts each month to provide life-changing bill payment for those in need through our fellowship fund. It is learning together how best to love our neighbors, all of them, even while we try to ignore the media and the other influences that would try to have us degrade whole groups of God's children. It means that when we leave a text like today's, we leave it changed, seeking holiness in new ways, in our workplace, in our school, at the shopping mall, and to all of the places we will return this week and for all the weeks to come. Be holy, for the Lord your God is holy. Amen.